so much for being here with us. My name is Caleb, but my friends call me Cal. I am a stroke survivor. I am a son. I'm an uncle. I am a brother. I am also the founder and chief vision officer at Genyus Network, which is a global community and story sharing platform for people touched by life-changing trauma. And importantly for today, for this very, very important session that you have joined us with, I am our facilitator for today. This session is a really important part of this Inspired Insights for Brighter Futures conference. It's incredible to be involved and to be able to hopefully illuminate some stories from the lens of the living experience to show the diverse stories that come from a living experience, and ultimately to stimulate your thinking to optimize your work and impact. So right now, what I want to do is welcome you into, I'm coming from my house, which is in Naarm, in the Kulin Nation, part of the Kulin Nation, also known as Melbourne, Hipsterville, or also known as Coffeeville. I've certainly got lots of coffees, or maybe a little bit of the home of the masked singer we have been known to be. But yeah, I wanted to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we are beaming to you from, and acknowledge the community of people, past, present, and emerging, who have traditionally owned this land. Now, to throw to our incredible panel that you are going to be inspired through their insights to hopefully create a brighter future. And I'm going to throw over to introducing you guys. Really, we want to find a little bit about who you are, what brings you here, and why this session is important to you. So I'm going to start with you, Carl. Who, what, and why?
Who, what, and why. All right. Thanks, Cal, and thanks for watching, everyone. Hopefully you're watching. But yeah, so my name's Carl. I normally tell people that I'm an NDIS participant. It's generally pretty obvious when I'm in my wheelchair. I'm not in my wheelchair today, but so I've got a disability. I've got cerebral palsy and use a power wheelchair. But I work as a support coordinator and a consultant in the NDIS space. And so I help businesses kind of, work on improving their services and also help people organise their NDIS plans. And so before my current role, I've just been, writing education around the NDIS and doing some work at conferences in the assistive technology space. Beyond that, I dabble in the occasional YouTube video.
Bit of a YouTube hole.
Yeah. And I take, too many photos of my dog. And being from Melbourne, I, drink too much coffee, but that's pretty much
Carl,
me. Yeah.
I hear you.
Yeah.
I hear you.
Yeah.
I've got a tea in one, coffee in another. No, thank you, Carl. So why is this session important for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, the profession of an occupational therapist can be often hard to describe, but I think it's really about problem solving and, making kind of individualized solutions for individuals. And any chance I get to kind of solve problems and work on, collaboratively improving systems and things, I would, jump at the chance.
Thank you so much, Carl. I feel like we're floating on a cloud with you there.
The background, but yeah.
You're like, it's a virtual background. It's a very real background. So going to a virtual background, I'm going to throw it over to you, Dennis. Who are you? What brings you to us? And why is this session important?
Well, funny enough, if you can read, my name's Dennis. I suppose what brings me here is my diagnosis of semantic frontotemporal dementia, which I received about 8 years ago. And I was given 3 to 6 years to live. And my current plan is to outlive those bastards. I live in what's been described as a sunny south coast of New South Wales, in that little gap between where the bushfires got and the floods got. But unfortunately, viruses walk through the area quite frequently and shut things down. Mm. It's amazing how these people can see viruses.
Yeah.
Now, one of the reasons I want to contribute to this is to try and facilitate people's understanding about the diversity and how dementia can impact on people. I'm a participant in the NDIS, if participating is the right word. I might be one of the oldest people in the NDIS. So I got in at about before.
Well, thank you so much, Dennis. Thanks for joining us, and I'm really excited to hear about your living wisdom that you can share with us to illuminate some of these insights. And finally, I want to throw to you, Grace, Miss McLaughlin.
Sure. I'm Grace. Who I am is maybe a hard question. So I'll just say I'm 25 and I'm from Northcote. I struggle with mental illness. I have since I was a teenager. And I'm really passionate about, advocating for mental health and for improving the mental health system as well. And a big part of that is, I think, listening to and harnessing the lived experience voice wherever we can, which is, I guess, what brings me here today.
Thank you, team. Thanks for sharing already some of those little insights and those intros as to who you are, because this session, very aptly named Guidance for Meaningful Engagement with a panel of living experts, is really apt, because I really believe that there is such untapped power in sharing these non-biased insights, these sort of uninfluenced stories, because it is about story sharing. I know that for me, in my journey, particularly, having a stroke 12 years ago, it's been about the story that I've felt part of, and then the story that I've eventually become the lead in and the controller of. And I think that there's great insight that you've each got to share about how you have taken the reins of your own story and your own narrative. So to start talking about some of those narrative experiences that you have had, I want to ask you a question. The first question is really about what has hindered your experience thus far. You've each described some of that particular living experience that you have. And I'm really interested to know, I want to start with you, Carl. What has hindered your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big, meaty question, but I think...
let's go deep. Let's go deep.
Yeah, let's go straight away. I think many people with disability would feel that, the expectations others have on you can be a real barrier. And so if people have low expectations of what you can do, that can really hinder, your experience or your life. And I mean, I was, lucky enough, in my view anyway, to go to a mainstream school, primary school and secondary school. And I think, there were people telling my parents that, because of my physical support needs, I might be better suited in a special school or a special developmental school or something along those lines. I think, looking back, if that did happen, that would have been something that really hindered, my, both my education, but also, the soft skills around communication and talking to people and conflict resolution and all of these things. And so I think, when people make assumptions about what you can and can't do because of your disability, that can be the the biggest thing that can hinder you on your journey. And it's not to say that that people don't need support, or people, I'm not saying that everybody can do everything that they want, but it's about the assumptions. And so, I think making sure that you always kind of check and ask and investigate and stuff like that, rather than assuming, definitely is, the way of minimizing any of this, damage you can do.
Have any of those assumptions been made about you?
Well, it's tricky because I've been relatively lucky that I don't think I've had too much kind of direct kind of discrimination. But I think there's definitely been some, behind the scenes. It might be around applying for jobs and, not making it through, certain hurdles because of, the disability. And that's something that it can be hard to kind of pin down, that discrimination, but there's that kind of feeling that it's often there. And also, I think just in general, moving away from that a little bit, just access issues are always a big one. Again, using a power wheelchair and being a wheelchair user, the most common thing is, having steps in shops or in education facilities or in houses, and it makes access to everything a lot more difficult. So, kind of the, moving out of home was a lot harder because I had to kind of, pretty much renovate a place before I could move. Even moving with my parents was always more difficult because I needed to make sure that the bathroom was, modified and all of that stuff. And, this is no one's, in the private sector anyway, there's no one's real fault. But I think just general infrastructure is a big barrier for people.
Okay.
And
can I just ask, sorry, Carl, I just want to, I feel like this piece around judgment is a really important thing. And it's incredibly, I know that for me in my journey, it's incredibly impactful depending on, I started out using a wheelchair, and I used to have an eye patch. I've then had a walking stick, and now I don't use any particular aid to navigate. I still have really considerable diplopia, so double vision and nystagmus and dizziness and all sorts of things. But it's largely invisible to people.
Yeah.
In terms of that judgment in a social context, have you ever felt in particularly hindered in that in any sort of social experience or any clinical experience?
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where I can't really pinpoint any example, but I think it does happen, often. And it might be one of those things where it happens kind of so often that I've kind of, internalized it a bit, or I don't notice it a bit. Yeah. And it's one of those things where, so my partner doesn't have a disability, and when we first started, going out, she'd often feel really kind of uncomfortable when people were kind of, staring at me or, making comments or stuff like that. And it's things that I didn't really notice, perhaps because it's so common.
But she did.
But she did, and she found it really kind of, upsetting in a way. There's been some examples of big accessibility fails and things like that, but I think it's just what I was saying at the start around, if people assume because someone's got the assumption is, if you've got a visible disability, then, you can't do, as much, which in some respects is true, but in also in others it's completely wrong. So, I'm able to work in open employment. I was able to, go to university and stuff like that. And so, if I listened to these assumptions that people had, or my parents listened to them earlier on, then I might not have, been able to get to where I am today.
I think that around assumptions can happen in a social context, and also, in my experience, in a clinical environment as well.
Yep.
And some of those things that are positioned as maybe guesstimates about the outcome for someone can be, I think, intended to be helpful, but they can be a real hindrance. I want to move to you, Dennis. How about for you? What has hindered your journey thus far?
Probably, in a simple statement, people's lack of understanding about what dementias are all about. Carl was talking a bit about some discrimination and so on. And I hate to say this to a man who has a wheelchair, but the worst case I've felt discriminated against is when I've been standing beside someone with a wheelchair, because everyone sees the wheelchair, don't see the hidden disabilities, obviously.
Yeah.
Yep.
They don't want to take that into account. One thing I've found that works really well is the more people become aware of how dementia affects people's lives from a living experience rather than from a clinical perspective, the better people's understanding is, and the more support that happens. I think the worst people for lack of understanding are the clinicians. They
Is that because of the information that's divulged, or?
Well, partly because their understanding is very clinical.
Okay.
One aspect about dementia is most of the things that are being revealed about it, it's not stuff that can be measured clinically. Just to give you a good example, one of the big handicaps I have is because I've got a semantic form of dementia.
Okay.
It's supposed to affect my language. It does to some extent, but what I find now is that when I see words I aren't familiar, I look at what they mean and track down their meaning, and often the way they're being used is contrary to the way they mean. So
that language is an incredibly important thing.
And one aspect that goes with that is signage. I must admit, I've always taken some amusement in some of the confusing signs that we see around the place, because I have a background in education. But prior to that, part of what I was involved in was actually creating maps, seeing how maps are being produced today. Well, just directions. For example, there's some roadworks in the area. There's thousands of detour signs. And if you followed the detour signs, you would be seeing detour signs for the rest of your life because they're circular. If you've got local knowledge, you're safe. But if you're travelling through the area, you're not. There has been a lot of change in the last 10 years, I suppose. And one thing that's now beginning to emerge is things about the environment that could be improved, not just for people with dementia, but for, I won't say an ageing population, but a maturing population.
Yeah, be kind, Dennis. But also, is that, when you say the environment, what do you exactly mean by that?
Well, for example, the ability to navigate a streetscape.
Okay.
I have a regular coffee meeting with an old mate of mine. I say an old mate because he's an old student of mine, but he's 10 years older than me.
Brilliant.
And just navigating the local main street, where you'll have a really bad problem in Melbourne with all the coffee shops. Where does the shop begin and end? Because it flows out into the pavement and impairs your navigation in the street.
So clear signage in built environments has definitely been a hindrance in your navigation and that agency of getting whatever you need.
And that's compensated with familiarity of the environment.
Okay.
If you're familiar with an area, that can compensate for that, but it can also confuse it because the signage may not be reinforcing the actual
thing. Yeah, that's a really good point, Dennis.
Yeah.
And now, Grace, I want to hear from you, from your unique lens, with what you describe as mental illness, with managing your mental health. What has hindered your experience the most?
The biggest thing that I come across really frequently is actually just access to supports is really hard.
Okay.
Supports are really not easy to access easily or quickly. We have quite a broken mental health system here in Victoria, with a lot of gaps, and it can often take months or years to get appropriate supports. I can share a bit of an example of what I'm talking about. Probably about 5 years ago now, I was looking for some more support. So I put in a referral for an eating disorder service. There was about and I did an assessment with them, and it was about 6 weeks between like when I put in the referral and when I got an outcome. They told me I wasn't eligible for their service. They said I didn't fit their requirements. Instead, they suggested I see a psychologist and a dietitian. So then I put in another 2 referrals. I put in one to my, local community mental health team, and one youth mental health service. Then I don't know how long passed. There was the waiting period. It's never just like you put it in and 3 days later you know or not. When that time passed, the local mental health team said I wasn't unwell enough for their services. And the youth mental health team said I was too unwell for their services. So again, I was in this missing middle, which is really common. And then instead what was suggested was another kind of therapy for which there was an 18-month wait. So it took me about 2 years to link in with services. And in the meantime, I was incredibly distressed with no support and getting more and more unwell. So I think that was one example from about 5 years ago, but almost every time we try and engage with mental health services, you have something similar to that. Maybe it won't take you 2 years, but you often can't get the help when you need it. And so you're often left really distressed and only getting more distressed as well. So I think one important thing for clinicians to remember is that when you first meet someone, it might have been months or years that they've been trying to access help. It's not just, oh yeah, my GP told me to come a week ago and now I'm seeing you. We're pretty desperate once we get there.
Yeah, right. So it may be a tiring journey even to that point, and an exhausting process. It's
also not just you put in a referral, it's you put in a referral and then you have to call up to, follow it up, and then probably make 3 or 4 phone calls, back to your GP or whoever put in the referral. And it is also exhausting when it was for me when I was that unwell.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Grace. Now, I want to invert that question, which is about what hindered, and really think about now what has helped our journeys. I took some notes here about assumptions, discrimination, judgment. People's misconceptions is a really big thing. I think, especially when it's visible or invisible, it brings up numerous issues that in the living experience when we aren't necessarily armed with maybe how to translate our living experience. But in terms of what helped, I know that for me, my OT actually was the trigger, a positive trigger for me in how I perceived myself. I first referred to myself as a stroke victim, jokingly about something. I said, I'm very young to be a stroke victim, blah, blah, blah. But she offered me a reframe of that and said, you're not a stroke victim, you're a stroke survivor. So there's been a lot of things that I can pinpoint that have helped me on my journey. And I'm really curious to know about your journeys, about what has helped you. I might start with you, Dennis. What's the biggest thing that has helped you in your journey thus far?
Well, people becoming more aware of how the condition affects me, because no 2 people are the same.
Mm-hmm.
And then taking time to analyse and discuss things rather than work on simple assumptions. One aspect of that that's been important is a mutual understanding. If we're talking about it, OT, what she thought she could do at the start wasn't going to be of great value to me. And we now have a beautiful understanding where she's trying to anticipate how things are going to progress with me. And I've also said that, for example, I've got an example here of just having handrails going back a couple of years. I didn't need them.
Yep.
But I said at the same time, one day I will, but if I've got them in place before I need them, I'll be familiar with them and be able to use them. But if they come when I need them, I won't be able to use them.
It's late, a bit late to the party, guys.
Yeah.
I think that is a really important thing, that sort of pre-thinking. It's from an OT lens, using your expertise to think in advance for someone. Because as you described, Dennis, your OT really sort of adjusted the sails for your ship as you went. And I think that's a really important thing for an occupational therapist, to tap into your own expert knowledge and capacity to do that, to sort of pre-think about how this journey might shape for someone with an experience such as you, Dennis.
One aspect to go with that too was having, for want of a better word, co-design.
Co-design, awesome.
That's a good topical word for the moment.
It's a bit of a buzzword. Hopefully it's not a trend, although on Twitter or a beehive, it doesn't go away. We want it to stay around.
The ability to co-design, negotiate the requirements, and even better, to be able to be involved in the implementation of those.
Have you been involved in any particular co-design experience that you can share with us? What experience have you been involved with?
It's probably not a good example, but one issue I've had was keeping track of time.
Okay.
The first suggestion from the OT was, some magic devices. We won't mention Alexa.
Okay.
That sort of thing that could do all wonderful things for you. But I suggested that's not going to really be good for me.
Okay.
And then she had an idea of some analog old things you might call clocks.
Okay. I got one just there. It's a bit slow at the moment.
But again, they weren't going to be quite really usable how I would operate. And I took it as a challenge, and I actually wrote some software to build my own clock that talks the way I want it to talk. So rather than giving a classical chime every 15 minutes, which is a good idea, mine actually plays little bits of craft work.
Ah, nice. So very specific.
Yeah.
Nice.
And it's unique and it works beautifully for me.
Okay.
I know that I use Alexa as a good example because at the time that was being mentioned, I knew a lot of people that in a similar situation had been encouraged to use Alexa, and they were quite enthusiastic.
Okay, cool.
6 months later, no one's using it because they have a lot of novelty value, but it wasn't something that was going to keep pace with the progression of their disease or something they're going to be necessarily familiar with down the road, even though it's because there's a different technology.
Well, when we get to the final question, which is going to be about putting a bit of your inventor hat on, Dennis, maybe we can think about how how we can innovate a little bit with our audience of OTs as well, to innovate around that space. But before we go into that question, I want to stick with what has helped your journey thus far. I might go to you, Grace. What's helped?
Finding people who use trauma-informed care has been really important.
Okay.
I don't really talk about my diagnosis anymore because it's really stigmatized and often impacts the care I get.
Yeah.
Like even within mental health facilities as well as society more generally. So people who don't use trauma-informed care, I'll often get those kind of a stigmatizing treatment from, I guess. I don't really know how to explain it. But people who can look at what I'm experiencing and can look at my responses and be like, oh, well, that's just a trauma response. Of course, Like, that makes so much sense. That has been so much more helpful, and I can actually look at what's going on for me and work through that. Yeah, I don't know.
No, beautiful. They're beautiful. That's great. So that sort of specificity of that, I guess, that acknowledgement has been really helpful for you. That's what I hear.
Yeah,
that's beautiful. Thanks, Grace. When that's happened, has that felt kind of affirming of where you're at?
Yeah, and it makes things make so much sense too. Of course, it's validating, and that's great. But it's just like, oh, of course, like that makes sense. And or every time I hear a new person's perspective on it or something, and something else clicks, it just is really, really helpful. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Now, Mr. Carl, on your lovely cloud, what about for you? What's helped the most?
So I think, not specifically OT related, but just in general, having adequate funding is the big one. And this, could be NDIS funding, could be aged care funding, could be, mental health community funding. So, none of us can do our best work without funding. So we always have to make sure that, we hold governments to account and all of that stuff. So, pre-NDIS, my family had to do way more than what was appropriate for them or for me. It was bad for my independence and all of that stuff, and not great for them. So, having good funding is very important, and that's something that we need to keep fighting for. But I suppose more around OTs, what Dennis was saying is, quite accurate in that, I always want someone who, sees myself as an equal partner in any kind of decision-making process, rather than sees me as someone who gets advice and takes their advice and just settles with that. So, a good example would be, again, wheelchairs. So I'm a bit of a unique shape, which means my wheelchair seat needs to be unique shape. And so whenever I have a wheelchair fitting, there's tension between, getting the right seat that's posturally appropriate and having one that is functional for me. So, for example, I've had a wheelchair seat fitting where it was so well fitting, so well cushioned, and so well padded that I was, I was in there and I was very well supported. And the OTs loved it. But I hated it because I couldn't move. I couldn't move my arms very well. I couldn't reach my drink in my cup holder. I couldn't, bend over to pat my dog, and so it was clinically the right option, but practically useless, and would have made the quality of my life worse. And so I think it's having, an OT who actually appreciates that there's more than just the clinical correctness.
And do you feel like was there an OT that did that, like in terms of what helped?
There was, and that's what I, I suppose what I'm saying is, I was lucky to have an OT that listened to me when I said that it wasn't practical, and then they were humble enough to say, okay, let's dial back some of this.
Bring it on.
And that's what we want. And I've had other experiences where they've been more reluctant to do that, and in my mind, that's been a negative for me. So So the good ones are, as
Are the
Jazz was
equal
saying,
partnered ones.
co-design. Yeah.
I think that's beautiful. That actually makes me really think about, in terms of, my experience, my living experience in lots of sectors. Being even labelled as a consumer, it's such a it sort of heightens my position, as it highlights that I am a recipient of services, that's the most prime thing that I am when I hear that term. And so I really believe, like you, Carl, that when we find these equitable partnerships, and from an OT's point of view, when you create the step for someone else to get up, that's how we create equity. So, and when we perceive one another as equal partners in this journey, it's a very important, impactful and mobilizing pathway to go on. So echoing to sort of what you've talked about, Dennis, even Grace, what you've talked about, and I know that matters, the jargon, the clinical jargon, the diagnosis, the way you're referred to, the way you're guided, it's incredibly impactful as to how we progress along our narrative, our own journey. So, I just wanted to really highlight that is a really important thing, and it's a really strong takeaway that I think you, who are watching, can take away into your own practice. The next thing that I really want to talk about, while we've got only a couple of minutes left, Dennis, Carl, Grace, I want you to put on your innovator hat, and I want you to think about what might an OT do to change their practice to help someone in the future with a similar experience like yours. So how might someone change their practice? I'm going to start with you, Dennis.
Okay. I'd say the first thing to do is plan to take more time. The more time you spend initially, the better the results are going to be.
Yep.
And consider language. And one thing I thought important to say is just that term, OT. Yeah, I was told you need to see an OT. And yes, that's an occupational therapist, but how does that relate to me? And I've got a little note down to myself saying, you need to really enhance the understanding about what the profession's about. It's a broad area because...
yeah. How do you get specific with that one? That's beautiful.
Because a lot of people are just now using the term OT to refer to a horrible twit.
Oh, okay, sure. Well, OTs, if you're listening, horrible twit, yeah. No, that's great.
They haven't taken the time with them to explain what's happening.
Yep.
Things take so long. I've got a horrible example that's just happened this week of, a friend who's got a form of dementia but is aged, and what was identified some time ago was the magic access ramp. But because of the slope and stuff, it's a real complicated question, and it's been going on for, since last year, shall we say. Mm-hmm. Work has actually begun on what's going to happen, but unfortunately, this person had a fall and is now in hospital.
Okay.
And I think all that could have been prevented if the process had been able to be done quicker.
Pre-planning.
Yeah, and a simpler way of doing things. One thing I like is the OT planned some modifications to some kitchen cabinets, which are brilliant.
Yeah.
It took literally 6 months between concept to before they were actually in place. 2 weeks later, I walked through Bunnings and there's the same thing. Unfortunately, the Bunnings product was like $100. The process of getting this done through the system was close to $1,000.
Well, that ties right back to Carl's funding piece around what helped. Yeah.
Need more
Okay.
quicker funding.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Innovator Dennis. I'm going to go to Innovator Carl now. How might someone improve their practice?
I'm not sure if you could call this an innovation or not, but quite a few years ago, I worked in marketing for a wheelchair company.
Mm-hmm.
I won't name names because I'm, no vested interests in this conversation. But we often went to expos and stalls, and obviously I'm a power wheelchair user myself, and spoke to probably hundreds of OTs over the years, both those who were students as well as those who have been in the sector, practicing for many years. And the amount of OTs who would refuse to try these wheelchairs, would refuse to jump in and go for a drive, was really high. And it was always fascinating for me. Sometimes they said things like, "Oh, I don't really want to do that. I don't feel safe doing that." Or, "Oh, no, I don't want to do that in case, I look a bit silly when I'm driving around." Or, "Oh, I drove one 5 years ago and that's enough for me." And these are the people, I suppose, could be someone prescribing these devices that, my bum is sat in for 14 hours a day for 5+ years. And so, I suppose I want you to, dive in and get invested and try these things out, try out the equipment. Don't just read it in a book, give it a go.
I love that.
Because it's also fun, and
that is
it's something
perfect.
that, like you don't often get a chance to drive a wheelchair around. So take it, and
grab the bull by the horns, give it a go yourself, get your own living experience.
That's right. But I think, also if someone's saying that they're feeling embarrassed to try a wheelchair, or they're worried they're going to make a mistake, if that's your view of it, your clients or the people that you're working with might feel the same. So, if you've got that kind of inherent reluctance, imagine someone who has acquired a disability, So I think, there's little things where it can make a big difference, rather than just getting a brochure and saying, try this wheelchair. If I had an OT who said, I've driven X, Y, and Z feels the best off-road, I would really respect their opinion rather than them just
nothing
saying
more powerful than a personal referral.
Yeah.
We're just coming to the very end, and I want to go to you, Grace, Miss Innovator, or Ms. Innovator. How about for you? How do you think just really quickly? How do you think someone can improve the pathway for someone else?
I think it's about listening to the lived experience voice wherever you can and advocating for that as well. Co-designing and co-producing programs, services, aspects of services wherever you can. For those who don't know, co-production is like a process of collaborating with people with lived experience as well as professionals, or perhaps people with lived experience do it on their own. But it's usually in collaboration and giving people with lived experience equal weight in the design and delivery of whatever it is that you're doing. It might be a research project, it might be building a new building, it might be developing a new program.
That is absolutely wonderful, Grace. I really want to end on that note, because that the pathway from co-design is through to the co-production, and the systemic value that has for people with living experience in partnering with occupational therapists on the journey of life and optimal quality of life, which we're all on, is an absolute imperative. For Genius Network, something that we always talk about is about creating safe spaces. So something that I want to end on is when we talk about a safe space, we're not talking about just something with like high vis and necessarily just rails, or even something that is more in the built environment that is physically accessible. A safe space is actually an acronym that stands for a specific, affirming, fun, and engaging space. Dennis, Carl, and Grace, you've all illuminated what is hindered is things when they're not specific. But when it is specific for you, it's a much more progressive and positive experience. When we work with the affirmation rather than deconstructing or focusing too much on what we can't do, when we work towards the affirming, it's incredibly important. Making it a bit fun. You know, Carl, you just talked about that concept of get in the wheelchair yourself. Like, make it fun. And also increase the engagement. It's not just about pushing information at people, it's about pulling it as well. So it's a push and pull. It's like a little bit of a tango. Not that I can really tango, I'll be too dizzy. But I just wanted to leave you in the audience with that. Thank you so much. To our living expert panel, thank you so much. Mr. Dennis, give us a wave. Thank you. Grace, give us a wave. Thank you. And Carl, give us a howl. Bring it on, my friend. Thank you so much. To you in the audience, thank you so much for spending some time with us. And the last thing I want to say is to leave you with this question. How are you creating a safe space? A specific, affirming, fun, and engaging space. Thank you to our living experts on the panel, and thank you to you, and have a fantastic rest of your conference. See ya.